Hi, my fabulous fifth graders. Okay, so today you get to hear chapter 17, Alliances. And then on Thursday, we'll read chapter 18 together on Zoom. Remember, when we left off, Mrs. Hyatt had called the entire fifth grade to a special assembly where she told them, stop the contest. But when they said, yes, Mrs. Hyatt, they only answered in a 3-word sentence, so it doesn't seem like they're stopping. As he walked toward his first period class, Dave felt relieved. He was glad Mrs. Hyatt had put an end to the contest. He was especially glad that he wouldn't have to actually mark a big L on Lindsay's forehead. Remember, Lindsay and Dave had their own private contest going where the loser had to have an L in Sharpie on their forehead. Or the reverse of that. Now he could just think about his schoolwork again because he was really a pretty good student. That's why he was always in the high math group. But as he went into the math room, he didn't talk to his friends, and they didn't talk to him, and none of the girls were talking either. No one was actually sure that the contest was over, and no one was taking chances, including Dave. The bell rang, and as everyone took their seats, it was still completely quiet. Mrs. Escobar got right down to business. All right, students, we're still working on metric conversions, and let's see, who's got an answer for the first homework problem? Lindsay raised her hand, and when Mrs. Escobar nodded, she said, 312. Mrs. Escobar frowned. 312 what? Lindsay said, degrees Celsius. Mrs. Escobar looked at Lindsay. You heard what the principal said a few minutes ago, right? Lindsay nodded. About how this little game needs to stop? Lindsay nodded again and then raised her hand. Mrs. Escobar nodded, and Lindsay said, but why? Why? Said the teacher. Because it's not good for anyone. It slows down our classwork, like right now. We should be doing math, and instead we're talking about not talking. Lindsay said, math is numbers. Yes, said Mrs. Escobar, but we need to use words to talk about how we're using numbers. You know that. You all know that. So stop this right now. Remember, Mrs. Escobar was one of the teachers who said no thank you to the contest. Lindsay stood up and pointed at the dry erase board. May I? Mrs. Escobar said, go ahead. Lindsay had her homework paper in one hand and a marker in the other. She wrote out the numbers for the first problem and then showed the 3 steps she used to get the correct answer. She turned to Mrs. Escobar, and when the teacher nodded, she said, how's that? Mrs. Escobar was starting to boil over. That's such an interesting metaphor, isn't it? Think about a pot of water and it starts to bubble and boil, and then the water starts to spill over the edge and sizzle on your stovetop. Mrs. Escobar seems like she's getting really angry. Boil over. I love it. I am not amused by this, Lindsay. I know what you're doing and I will not stand for it. Now stop it. Lindsay stood at the board. She pointed at the problem. Is it right? Another 3 words. Dave knew that look on the teacher's face. It meant trouble, serious trouble. And not just for Lindsay. He held his breath and waited for the explosion. But the very next moment, Dave amazed himself. He raised his hand. Mrs. Escobar had to grit her teeth, but she managed to say, yes. Dave pointed at the solution on the board and said, mine is different. Without asking permission, Dave was on his feet. He grabbed the marker from Lindsay and scrawled his work onto the board. He had the same answer, but he had worked with fractions instead of decimals. Hey, 5th grade math is the best. Mrs. Escobar said, "How many of you did it the way Dave did?" About half the hands went up. And the way Lindsay solved it, the other half went up. The teacher nodded. "That's good. Does everyone see why it can be done both ways?" Everyone nodded. "Okay, here's a tougher question. Kelly, which was easier, Dave's way or Lindsay's way?" Kelly said, "Lindsay's." "Really?" asked the teacher. "How come?" "Fewer steps." And all around the room, Mrs. Escobar saw heads nodding. She saw the special light that shows up on a kid's face when understanding happens. She smiled. "That's right. Decimals really do make things easier." "I agree." Tyler raised his hand and said, "With a calculator," which got a laugh from the whole class. And as they laughed, Dave and Lindsay looked at each other for about half a second. Not quite a friendly look, but similar. Then Dave thought, this means the contest is still on. And he wasn't sure how he felt about that. The class sailed through the rest of the conversion problems. Miles to kilometers, kilograms to ounces, acres to hectares, and on and on. And every student responded using 3 words or less. Mrs. Escobar knew the kids weren't obeying Mrs. Hyatt. She knew they were still counting words. But honestly, at this moment, she didn't care. She was in the middle of an amazingly productive class period. Everyone was so focused, so alert, so engaged. She liked this day much better. And what was happening in the other first period classrooms on Wednesday? Classrooms where Lindsay and Dave were not on hand to provide some leadership? As science class began, Mrs. Marlowe had already decided to make an example of the first kid who gave her a 3-word answer, and it happened to be Kyle. "I asked you to tell me about the order Lepidoptera," the teacher said. Kyle nodded. "Butterflies and moths," he repeated. "And that's all you know?" she asked. He nodded again. "Pretty much," which got a giggle from the class. Mrs. Marlowe grabbed a notepad and picked up a pencil, reading aloud as she wrote. "Dear Mrs. Hyatt, Kyle has refused to obey your instructions. He is not participating in the class discussion, and he..." Kyle raised his hand, and Mrs. Marlowe snapped. "What?" Ooh, these teachers. Oh, you guys. I promise I will never snap at you in this classroom ever. "I am participating." "No," she said. "You're deliberately using as few words as possible, and you are disobeying the principal." Kyle shook his head. "I'm conserving." She said, "That's nonsense. Conservation means..." Kyle finished the sentence. "Not wasting." Mrs. Marlowe glared at him. That's a fierce glare. "Conservation is for energy and water and soil and forests. Words don't need conserving." "Maybe they do," Kyle said, which was awfully brave of him. It's hard to stand up to grown-ups, isn't it? Even though sometimes you might know that you're right. And Mrs. Marlowe, in this instance, is not being very kind. She's definitely in the wrong. And all the kids in the class nodded their agreement with Kyle, which was also very brave. Mrs. Marlowe felt herself getting angrier. However, she was an extremely logical person, and she had to admit that Kyle had a point. Anybody who had ever eaten lunch in the teacher's room or sat through a whole faculty meeting would have to agree that a lot of words get wasted during the school day. And all that endless gabbing had made the Unshushables so famous, that was 99% waste. But she said, regardless of that, the principal said you must all participate normally in class. Kyle scrunched up his face. "What's normal?" he asked. Mrs. Marlowe said, "In this case, it means talking the way the principal wants you to, the way I want you to, the way everyone usually talks and answers, normally." Kyle said, "Can normal change?" "Well," Mrs. Marlowe paused. She paused because just 3 days ago, they had discussed climate change, and she had explained how a normal high temperature now would have been considered abnormal 100 years ago. And she knew Kyle would remember that. The whole class probably remembered. This was a very bright group. She continued, "Yes, you could say that, but it's certainly not normal to use only 3 words at a time or no words at all, not at school." Kyle shrugged. "Works for me." Mrs. Marlowe thought back to all the times in the past week she had had to yell at Kyle about his nonstop whispering, about his constant joke telling, about his never-ending comments on anything and everything that ran through his twitchy little head. And she looked at Kyle sitting there quietly, giving her his full attention. And every other student was doing the same thing. And suddenly, the idea of trying to make these kids talk, actually demanding that they all go back to being noisy, self-absorbed chatterbrains, it simply didn't make sense. She's changing her mind. Oh, she's changing her mind. She's going to be one of our yes teachers. So Mrs. Marlowe decided to go ahead with her lesson for the day, and she adjusted herself to the new normal, because the new normal was at least 10 times better than the old normal. In social studies, there were more oral reports, and Mrs. Overby called on Ed Canner and Bill Harkness to go first. The boys walked to the front of the room, stood shoulder to shoulder, and both of them looked down at the index cards in Bill's hands. Ed said, "Italy is old." Then Bill said, "The Roman Empire." Then Ed said, "Ruled the world." And Bill said, "For many centuries." And Mrs. Overby said, "What do you 2 boys think you're doing?" Ed said, "Giving our report." And Bill said, "On Italy." "No," said the teacher, "you're still playing that game, counting words." "But we practiced," Ed said. "We're ready," Bill said. And Ed said, "Can we finish?" Like the other teachers up and down the 5th grade hall, Mrs. Overby had to make a decision. Remember, she was also on the no contest list. We'll see if she changes her mind. She had to go with the flow, which promised to be very quiet and orderly, or call for the principal, raise a ruckus, and try to force these kids to be their regular old noisy selves again. As a student of history, Mrs. Overby knew about the power of a grassroots movement. She also knew about the power of civil disobedience. That's like peaceful protest. But mostly, she decided that this no talking craze was actually a pretty good social experiment. Plus, she didn't feel like the kids thought that they were winning and she was losing. It wasn't like that. They were just having a different kind of communication experience together. That's all. True, Ed and Bill's report on Italy was choppy and awkward and a little hard to follow as they passed the narration back and forth like a ping pong ball. But the boys made all their points. Learning took place, and the whole class sat silently and paid close attention. And the next 5 reports went almost as smoothly. What more could a social studies teacher want? So like the other teachers, Mrs. Overby chose the quiet way. Oh, great. And she decided she'd talk to the other teachers later in the morning and see how they were handling this thing. And she talked to Mrs. Hyatt too. Oh no, I'm afraid Mrs. Hyatt is going to be very angry, like big red plastic bullhorn angry. Language arts was the easiest class for the kids because Mr. Burton didn't even try to make them stop their activity. If they wanted to be quiet and talk only in 3-word bursts, he was all for it. Back at the front of his room, Mr. Burton said, "Eric and Rachel, please come up and sit in these chairs." When they were seated, he said, "You 2 are going to have a short debate. A debate is an orderly argument, and each of you will take opposite sides on the same issue. And the question is, should there be soda machines in school cafeterias? Rachel, you will argue for this question. And Eric, you will argue against it. So Rachel has to argue, not argue in a mean way, like, you're not my friend, but argue, meaning have a conversation where you're disagreeing with someone, but in a respectful way. So Rachel's going to say, I want soda machines in cafeterias at school. And Eric is going to say, we should not have soda machines. And they're going to have to give reasons why. That's what a debate is. Ready? You may use no more than 3 words for each statement. Eric and Rachel shook their heads, like they weren't ready. Mr. Burton said, don't worry, you'll both do fine. Eric, you first. You may begin. Eric said, soda machines, bad. Rachel shook her head and said, not bad, delicious. Eric frowned, too much sugar. Rachel smiled, I like sugar. Eric shook his head, sugar rots teeth. Rachel smiled a big smile, not mine. Eric said, milk is better. Rachel shrugged, try sugar-free. Eric said, still bad nutrition. Rachel held up her arm and made a muscle. I eat vegetables. Eric said, not everyone does. Rachel said, I like choosing. Eric said, soda is expensive. Rachel pulled $1 from her pocket. I have enough. Eric said, spend it smarter. Rachel said, what about freedom? Eric shook his head. Not at school. Rachel smirked. Very bad news. And they went on like that for about 5 minutes with no let up. All the kids were fascinated. And of course, so was Mr. Burton. He took furious notes, writing down each response, trying to record the kind of gestures the kids made, their facial expressions, their tones of voice. Very few words were being exchanged, but whole worlds of ideas were floating around as the kids tried to build their arguments. They got emotional, and the 3-word limit was clearly a problem. Still, they packed a lot into so few words. It was sort of like listening to cave people talk, or maybe Tarzan, hungry, eat now. And Mr. Burton wrote down some 3-word chunks of his own, which he intended to use in his human development paper. He wrote, every word counts. Choose power words. Remember Miles Davis. Miles Davis was a musician who, I think, if I remember correctly, played shorter pieces of music. I might have to look that up. As he looked at what he wrote, he thought, maybe I should write my whole paper using 3-word sentences. That would certainly get the attention of my professor. In music class, the kids entered the room and sat silently, just like yesterday afternoon. Mrs. Akers was sure the students were going to disobey Mrs. Hyatt's orders, and she was ready to take some drastic steps to stop this nonsense. But when she played an introduction and launched into Over the River and Through the Woods, everyone sang right out. The teacher was amazed. Mrs. Akers felt like there had been a glorious victory for the forces of law and authority, and she intended to write the principal a special note saying thanks for her strong leadership. In fact, the principal's talk was not the cause of the singing. Taryn had wrote a simple note, and she'd shown it to all the boys and all the girls as they came into the music room. Singing is not talking, okay? And by nodding, all the boys and all the girls had silently agreed that bending the contest rules just a little was a good idea. Besides, no one wanted the Thanksgiving music program to sound lousy, and their contest would be over by then anyway. The boys and girls in that first period music class might not have noticed it, but the important thing was not that they had agreed to sing. The important thing was that they had agreed on something, about anything. Fifth grade boys and fifth grade girls at Laketon Elementary School were actually cooperating and helping each other. And that's what was happening in the other fifth grade classrooms too. The boys and girls had joined forces without even realizing it. Together, they had resisted the pressure from the principal and from their teachers. They had used their wits and teamed up to prove that not talking was a simple, harmless activity. It wasn't like the boys and girls were getting all buddy-buddy or anything. And it wasn't like the teasing and taunting had completely stopped, because old habits were hard to break. But still, cooties were dying all over the place. That was one result. Another result of the morning classes was that the kids had won a new kind of respect from their teachers. Teachers have great respect for order and self-discipline. Teachers love to make careful plans and then put them into action. It's what they do. That's true. That's true. And teachers hate noise and disorder and bouncing kids because these things keep them from accomplishing their careful plans. I kind of like bouncing kids. We like exercise balls in my classroom and wobble stools, so you might get to bounce a little bit when you're in class with me. However, there was one gigantic problem with all this harmony and order and balance and peace that was blooming in the fifth grade hall. Mrs. Hyatt wasn't in the loop. That is a metaphor that means she doesn't know what's going on. She's not in the loop because she doesn't know what's happening in the classrooms. She was clueless about all of these new developments. In fact, the principal wasn't even in the building during that morning. She was across town working on next year's budget at the district office. She had left her trusty teachers to carry out her strict orders. But Mrs. Hyatt had organized her meetings to be sure that she would be back to school in time for fifth grade lunch, because the principal felt sure that she would be needed at lunch with her bullhorn to keep law and order, just like always. Because Mrs. Hyatt had complete confidence in her teachers. She was sure that by lunchtime, everything would be back to normal. Oh no. Oh no. Oh my goodness. Okay, on Thursday, our next chapter is called Adventures in the Red Zone. We're going to talk about what that means. And I want to show you something. A lot of times authors use big, bold, capital letters when they're trying to show their characters having strong emotions. So I'm going to show you how many big, bold, capital letters are just on the second page of this chapter. Oh my gosh. I have a feeling we're going to have a very unhappy Mrs. Hyatt when she comes back at lunchtime, and we may even get to see that big red plastic bullhorn make another appearance. So, guys, we're almost done with this book. Can you believe that? Adventures in the Red Zone. And then just a few more chapters after that. We're going to be done before you know it. Wow. And then on to one of my favorite books of the school year, which I'm so excited about. So have a wonderful, amazing day today. I will miss not seeing you on Zoom on Wednesdays, but I will catch you on Thursday morning and we will have some fun together. So have a great day today, my fantastic fifth graders, and I'll see you soon.